Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in this, the Clown Decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. If you want to keep up with all things Clown Decade, please do subscribe to the channel and of course become a channel member. Right, today we're going to be having a go at the BBC because once again they have put their foot absolutely in it. It's no secret to anyone that the BBC is biased. The funny thing is that every left-winger says it's too right-wing because of the whole Corbyn thing from a few years ago, plus the fact they, quote-unquote, always have reform on. That's probably because they're leading the polls, but anyway, that's much more justifiable than what they are doing and what the right wing accuse them of, which is blatant left-wing bias, which they obviously have more of, because obviously they have a little bit of a mix of political leanings within the BBC, but there is one overarching culture there, and it's largely one that comes directly from The Guardian, and I do mean that. But first, let's quickly cover what they've done. So this comes from the Telegraph's investigation into the Trump speech.
They played the following clip.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you, and we fight. We fight like hell.
Yeah, to me that's one of the most obvious cuts in the world. There is a clear cut in the background noise between saying Capitol Hill and the word and obviously the Telegraph go through that.
Walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
So that was actually said early in the speech. It was, we're going to march down to Capitol Hill and cheer on our congressmen and senators, who are obviously Republican. This was during the whole Stop the Steal thing, which, as far as I'm concerned, if people still believe that at this point, I mean, you're free to believe it, I suppose, but you're really barking up a dead tree. As far as I'm concerned, since President Biden was sworn in, stop the count, it was stolen by Biden, whatever, that's all null and void. You've gone through the ritual of bringing in a new president, therefore literally none of that matters. But it does matter that the BBC decided to completely clip President Trump and imply that he was in favour of the January 6th, let's call it, invasion on the Capitol.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we fight. We fight like hell.
Yeah, for those of you listening, that was a fast forward from the Telegraph's edit where it showed that the two parts they clipped together were 54 minutes apart, having two completely different contexts. Again, this is not impartial reporting. This is, to put it frankly, YouTube drama levels of pathetic to try and discredit someone. That's what the BBC were doing. And this obviously was reported everywhere. BBC completely misled viewers with edited Trump speech. An internal memo criticised the corporation over alleged breaches of impartiality, including a panorama special relating to the Capitol riots. So the BBC misrepresented a speech made by President Trump, we've been through all that, although in an internal memo, it accused the corporation of shocking breaches of impartiality. The memo said an edition of Panorama that was broadcast in October of last year, a week before the US election, had completely misled viewers by splicing together video from two parts of his speech in January 6, 2021 that made him say things he never actually said. In one section, Trump appeared to tell supporters he was going to walk to the Capitol with them to fight like hell. In fact, Trump said he would walk with them to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. He made the exhortation to supporters to fight like hell later in the speech when making false claims that the 2020 election had been stolen, which is the Times effectively saying Trump still bad, however nowhere near the level that Panorama were trying to say he was bad. And again, just to make it clear from my perspective, do I think the 2020 election was stolen? I think there was as much cheating going on in that election as you would get in any other election. It's not exactly odd for an election to occur and for foul play to be called from both sides, or especially the losing side. And also on top of that, it's nearly 2026 now. I don't think anybody cares anymore. The 19-page dossier seen by the Daily Telegraph was sent last month to the BBC board by Michael Prescott, who spent 3 years as an external advisor to the broadcast editorial guidelines and standards committee before leaving the role in June. Prescott, managing director of the PR firm Hanover Communications, and a former journalist, claimed that senior executives and the BBC chairman had ignored and dismissed a string of serious complaints raised by the corporation's own standards watchdogs, which isn't a shock, as we will go through. He wrote in his letter to the board, "I departed from the advisory role with a profound and unresolved concern about the BBC. My view is that the executive repeatedly failed to implement measures to resolve highlighted problems, and in many cases simply refused to acknowledge that there was an issue at all. A particular concern," he said, was a 1-hour panorama special called Trump, A Second Chance, that was broadcast on October 28 last year. So this isn't even just a complaint about this Trump thing. The Trump thing is one of many complaints. Prescott said he raised concerns with the EGSC and that David Grossman, senior editorial advisor to the committee, was asked to review the programme. Grossman highlighted alarming concerns about how Panorama had edited Trump's speech to his supporters. However, when his findings were presented to the BBC editorial bosses, they refused to accept that there had been any breach of standards and doubled down on its defence on Panorama. Which just goes to show how deep the rot is. The editorial board, the very tippy top of the BBC, are on board with Panorama journalists effectively lying to the British public about Trump. I mean, why do you think there's Trump derangement syndrome in America? Because there's bias in a lot of the media. Why is there in Britain? Because the literal national broadcaster is as bad, if not worse, than CNN. According to Prescott, at a meeting of the EGSC on May 12, Jonathan Munro, the BBC Senior Controller of News Content, said there was no attempt to mislead the audience about the content or nature of Mr. Trump's speech before the riot at the Capitol. It's normal practice to edit speeches into short film clips. Sure, but the point of short film clips is to give a decent idea of what was said there, not completely lie about it. I guess that's unless you work for the BBC. It's not a joke when I say this, but I actually have more journalistic integrity than the man who is basically running the BBC. And I'm just a guy who does videos in his spare time. Prescott also later wrote to Samir Sarr, the BBC chairman, noting that the splicing of two clips is a very, very dangerous precedent. After being told of the report, Donald Trump Jr., the president's eldest son, posted on X, "The fake news reporters in the UK are just as dishonest and full of..." I have to say, I'm not happy with the standards of politicians and their family, how they have dropped, where we are now swearing regularly on Twitter, and it's being obviously published on national newspapers, but, well, I guess that's the world we're in, and I've definitely not helped with that in the past, but anyway. Full of S as the ones here in America. Well, I've certainly agreed with that. The BBC said, "Well, we don't comment on leaked documents. When the BBC receives feedback, it takes it seriously, considers it carefully." Don't think that's true, according to this. Michael Prescott is a former advisor to a board committee where differing views and opinions of coverage are routinely discussed and debated, and you landed on the worst possible outcome, by the way. Well, if you thought the Trump thing was bad, let's just go to less than a month ago, in fact, where the BBC was told to broadcast Ofcom statement over misleading Gaza film. The BBC misled the general public so much over Gaza from a particular film that was broadcast by them. Ofcom basically said, "This is so bad you have to literally broadcast a correction. Corporation will air regulators' findings over How to Survive a War Zone documentary after it failed to make clear the teenage narrator was son of a Hamas official." Again, the national state broadcaster here in Britain literally posted, broadcast in fact, literal Hamas propaganda. That is what happened, and yet apparently it's leftists who say that it's too right-wing. Sorry, but every time the BBC has been found to be breaking impartiality rules, it always happens to be because it's too left-wing. The facts, once again, do not hold out for the leftists. The broadcaster has been told to air Ofcom's findings on BBC Two at 9 PM on a date to be determined, in line with the prominence given to the Hoyo Films documentary. It's the first time that the BBC has had to broadcast a statement from the regulator since Radio 2 aired the conclusions of an investigation into offensive comments made by Brandon Jonathan Ross about the granddaughter of the Fawlty Towers actor Andrew Sachs. I don't even know what that's referring to, but apparently this is as bad as slander against, I assume that's Joe Brand, it could be Russell Brand I guess, and Jonathan Ross. The BBC was forced to pull the Gaza film from iPlayer days after it released in February, after it emerged that one of the teenage narrators who featured was the son of a Hamas official, making the whole thing propaganda basically. Ofcom has ruled that the mistake was materially misleading for the audience. It meant that the audience did not have a critical bit of information which may have been highly relevant to their assessment of the narrator and the information he was provided. The media regulator said in a statement, "It has the potential to erode the very high levels of trust audiences would have expected in the BBC factual programme about the Israel-Gaza war, and I would agree with that. So Tim Davie, the BBC Director General, said on Thursday that covering the war in Gaza was the most challenging issue he had faced in his tenure, highlighting the difficulty surrounding the documentary. It's really not difficult to not broadcast a documentary that involved the son of a literal Hamas official, I'm just saying. If you make mistakes, it can impact trust. I worry about that. Oh, the BBC's had its trust impacted for literally decades. What it doesn't indicate necessarily is systemic bias or failure across the organisation. I'm very proud of what we're doing at the BBC. A spokesman for the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism said the BBC were long past being able to restore trust among the Jewish audiences. I don't particularly blame them for that. It wasn't a minor oversight, it was a grave lapse in editorial standards from our national broadcaster, just one of repeated anti-Semitism scandals that have recently engulfed the BBC. From paying licence fee funds to the family of a Hamas official to having to part way with Gani Lineker after he posted an anti-Semitic meme, and from refusing to call Hamas terrorists to broadcasting incendiary rhetoric about Zionists and calls for death and destruction at Glastonbury. Can't argue with any of that, really. The group has called for an independent investigation into the BBC's coverage of Israel and matters of Jewish interest, as, of course, this is not an isolated issue. I have to agree with pretty much all of that. The BBC have been pretty ridiculous with their broadcasting standards over recent years, and, well, it doesn't look like that there's been any improvement. It doesn't matter how much the watchdogs say, no, you can't do that, they will carry on doing that, because at the end of the day, anyone with a TV who wants to watch any live TV has to pay for a licence. I don't watch live TV, hence I don't pay for a licence. Now, at this point, I think there's something quite important that I would like to point out. Why is there so much left-wing bias at the BBC? Why does it seem that every time there's some leftist saying, oh, look at all this right-wing bias from the BBC, it never seems to hold? They always point out Laura Kusenberg, who is basically just not left-wing and therefore right-wing bias. There's the whole Corbyn in a communist hat thing, that was years ago, and again, nothing particularly came of it. Yet, whenever righties have a bit of an issue with the BBC, it always seems to stick. Trump thing being the latest one, obviously the Gaza problem was another huge one. And this is continuing while other broadcasters who are more susceptible to, say, the private market appear to have gone much less woke, especially Sky News. Not necessarily so much ITV and Channel 4, though I don't keep an eye on them as much. But then when it comes to the BBC, they seem to stick. Well, let's just go through a few examples. So, George Joshua Richard Monbiot is an English journalist, author and environmental and political activist. He writes a regular column for The Guardian and has written several books. Yes, this is one of the Guardian columnists that we tend to look at once every couple of weeks over on Laughing at the Guardian. Well, after graduating with a degree in zoology, that's what his degree was in, Monbiot joined the BBC Natural History Unit as a radio producer, making natural history and environmental programmes. He transferred to the BBC's World Service, where he worked briefly as current affairs producer and presenter before leaving to research and write his first book. And obviously from there was working as a columnist for The Guardian. My point here is going to be that there seems to be a revolving door between The Guardian and the BBC, and that probably informs why the BBC has such a hard left-wing bias. Obviously there's a mix of people in the BBC, but it certainly seems to lean left. Mary Louisa Polly Toynbee, I have absolutely no idea why she goes by Polly, is a British journalist and writer, and she's been a columnist for the Guardian newspaper since 1998. That is coming up to 30 years. Well, Toynbee worked many years for The Guardian before joining the BBC, where she was social affairs editor from 1988 to 1995. At The Independent, which she joined after leaving the BBC, she was a columnist and associate editor working with editor Andrew Marr, who also works at the BBC, by the way. She later rejoined The Guardian. She has also written for The Observer and Radio Times, and one time she was an editor for The Washington Monthly. I know a few of you will be thinking, hang on, that's from ages ago. I know, I'm leading up to the modern day. Paul Mason, he's a columnist, not for The Guardian to be fair, but for The New European, with monthly columns for Social Europe and Frankfurter Rundschau. I will say he has written for The Guardian, but not as a regular columnist. He was business correspondent and then economics editor of BBC Two television programme Newsnight from 2001, and culture and digital editor of Channel 4 News from 2013, becoming the programme's economic editor in 2014 and left in 2016. So Paul Mason's influence may be the answer to why Channel 4 News and Newsnight, along with a lot of the rest of BBC News, is very left-leaning. He was quite high up in both of these broadcasters. Marina Hyde, who attempts to write comedy pieces for The Guardian, has been doing so since 2000, again, there for 25 years. Now, to be absolutely fair to Marina, she doesn't work at the BBC, but just before working at The Guardian, I will say, she married Kieran Clifton, a director at the BBC. That was just before she got her job at The Guardian, by the way, so these two will be influencing each other, and there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that they are both very left-wing. How do I know this? I read a lot of Marina Hyde. Another Guardian columnist is Zoe Williams, who once again has a Guardian columnist, and, well, her mother happened to work for the BBC, which probably led to hosting BBC Radio 4's What the Papers Say and being a common panellist on Any Questions and Question Time. One thing I'm actually noticing by going through all this is that there's way more nepotism when it comes to the Guardian and the BBC than I thought, which is very funny considering that all these people are very much against things like private schools and other things that they would ascribe to nepotism. These people are the most I will pull the ladder up behind me people that you could ever find in society, by the way. I've never seen anything like it. Anyway, the most recent example of this revolving door between The Guardian and the BBC has to be Mirjana Spring, who is the BBC's first disinformation specialist and social media correspondent, and she's terrible at it. I did a whole video on how her first episode of the podcast, Conspiracyland, I think she called it, was effectively bringing up Carl Benjamin, Sergeant of a Cad, going to somewhere in Cornwall, I can't remember now, and just taking absolutely every single one of the local Green councillors' lies about him at face value and deciding not to correct any of it whatsoever, despite the fact it was pure disinformation. So Mirjana Spring's terrible at her job. But on top of that, after graduating from Oxford, she spent her time contributing to the Moscow Times and a few other papers, and undergoing work experience at The Guardian a private eye. Well, after graduation, she applied to various journalism programmes, including the BBC, but wasn't successful, but it was senior news reporter for The Guardian, Alexandra Topping, suggesting that Spring contact various BBC journalists that she admired, and Emily Maitlis replied to Spring and gave her an opportunity to work on Newsnight. She co-produced segments for the programme about protests across the French political spectrum, joining the Yellow Vests in December 2018. So, how does Mirjana Spring get a job at The Guardian? Work experience, absolutely fair enough. How does she then get a job at the BBC? Good word in from someone at The Guardian, which is fine. This isn't nepotism, this is getting your way into the network. This is just basic networking. It's fine. It's just, once again, it's through The Guardian to the BBC or through the BBC to The Guardian. There's a revolving door between the two, and this obviously indicates that this is because of a left-wing bias that both of them share. The BBC is effectively the broadcasting arm of The Guardian, or possibly the other way round. The Guardian is the print media for the BBC. After all, half of The Guardian's print media is sold straight to the BBC. Nobody buys The Guardian, probably because it's free to read online. So I hope that gets my points across. Why is the BBC so pro-Gaza, so anti-Trump? Well, it's the same with a lot of the media, because a lot of the media seem to go hand in hand with a lot of the left-wing print media. It's not just The Guardian, the New Statesman has came up with Paul Mason was also involved. But after all my time reading The Guardian, I have noticed over the years that a lot of them are actually ex-BBC employees, which made me think, oh, maybe that's why the BBC are so left-wing, and so I'm glad I finally got that put in video form, because I say it on streams, but, well, not everyone watches the streams, do they? But I think I will leave that video there. So, please do subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, do, of course, become a channel member and leave super chats and super thanks. Right. In terms of shilling, tonight it's Tosh News, tomorrow it's gaming, I'll be playing Deus Ex Human Revolution. After that, there will be Wolves of Westminster out on Friday. Right, I think with that, that's everything I had for you for today. So once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.